the Ukraine war has been a war of propaganda. The elites decided we're going to go to war. This really is Obama's folly. Obama was the one who planned the war in Ukraine back when he was president. And what happened is in 2014, he staged a coup. The Obama administration staged a coup and overthrew the legitimately elected government of Ukraine. We then installed a revolutionary junta, and then we started pouring weapons in to arm the soldiers of the revolutionary junta of Ukraine, and set in motion what has eventually ended up in a war between Russia and Ukraine. Without going into great detail about the war, there was this huge push to get the US, the UK, NATO all in for war. We were going to go to war against Russia, but we weren't going to fight it. We were just going to supply the Ukrainians, and everything would be wonderful because Russians are horrible. We've all been taught that. We've all been indoctrinated. But the fact is that Russia had its back to the wall. NATO was going to move in there with nuclear missiles in Ukraine. It was only a matter of time. And the nuclear missiles would be right on the Russian border, just like the Cuban Missile Crisis back when Kennedy was president, and the Soviet Union moved nuclear missiles into Cuba, and we said, no, we're not taking that. We're going to fight. And so we very nearly did invade Cuba, and fortunately, the Soviet president, Khrushchev at the time, I believe. But anyway, whoever was in charge of the Soviet Union at the time backed off, cut a deal. They pulled their missiles out of Cuba. We pulled ours out of Turkey. This time, there's nobody making any reasonable deals. And so we really just forced the Russians to go in, because otherwise the nation of Russia would be in peril. So as part of this, there's been all sorts of propaganda promulgated. One of the things early in the war was the myth of the ghost of Kiev. Western media, all of our newspapers put out this story about this wonderful Ukrainian pilot who was just the most skilled pilot in generations. He was a guy who had actually, they claimed, shot down 40 Russian jet planes. Turns out the ghost of Kiev wasn't an exaggeration. He didn't exist any more than Donald Duck in the comic books exists. He was nothing. There was no ghost of Kiev. There was no such pilot. It was a total concoction that was made up and promoted by Western media sources. So now we have a lot of claims. A lot of them are vague, but some specific, and they're claims about Russian war crimes. Well, you have a war of this magnitude, and it is a big war, and there are war crimes, and nobody can tell you that there aren't crimes on this side or on that side. But the most prominent of all of these was the claim that there were massive killings in the city of Bucha, which is near the capital of Ukraine, Kiev. Well, from the very beginning, when they first released the claims of Bucha mass killings, they did it with a video of what purported to be it was a Ukrainian vehicle driving down this road, and there were bodies with their hands bound behind their backs, And there'd be one here on the street, and then 100 feet up, there'd be another one, and then might be one or two here and another one here. It was a very peculiar sight. Now, I've tracked the Syrian war since actually before it even officially became a war. And so I've seen many terrible, grotesque murders by the Syrian terrorists who are trying to overthrow the legitimate government of Syria. And so I know what they look like. I've seen them. And when I looked at the Bucha crime scene, it just didn't ring true. Now, all of the media sources were saying, look at this, there's been killings, the Russians did it, we need to go after them, maybe we need to nuke them or something. But there were things they didn't know. Now, I look at these things as a career prosecutor. Many of you know that I was a Marine pilot, fought in Vietnam, and did also fought with the infantry there. But then I went back to law school, and when I came out, I went into the Army JAG Corps. I was an Army lawyer, and I ended up sort of following a prosecutorial track. And so I've overseen thousands and thousands of crimes. But as I looked at this, I said, well, first of all, we don't know who killed these people. We don't know where they were killed. We don't know when they were killed. We don't know why they were killed. And we have no motive for the Russians to have killed them. Well, that didn't stop the mainstream media. They just said, oh, people are dead, Russians are terrible, Russians did it. Well, here are some of the things that struck me. First of all, the setup was inconsistent with a genuine massacre, because rather than being hidden, the bodies were openly, deliberately displayed at random right at the curb of the road. They were at unnatural intervals. Mass shootings tend to happen in one location or in several, but people are brought together for mass shootings. They don't occur as onesies and twosies. These bodies wore white armbands, not the blue armbands that are worn by Ukrainian sympathizers. If the Russians were shooting people, why wouldn't they shoot the Ukrainian sympathizers rather than shooting the Russian sympathizers who wore the white armbands? The bodies did not appear until 4 days after the Russians had left. The mayor of Bucha made a public announcement when the Ukrainian troops drove the Russians out. He was ecstatic. He was joyous. Didn't mention a thing about bodies being discovered. It wasn't until the Ukrainian army had been there for 4 days that bodies started showing up. And these, keep in mind, these were not hidden. These were on main thoroughfares. Now, there was no motive for the Russians to have killed people as they're on their way out of town. Now, let's say, for example, that for some reason they decided to be vengeful and the Russians had decided to execute people. They occupied Bucha for 6 weeks, I guess, or more. They had plenty of time to identify the people they wanted, take them off deep in the woods, dig trenches, kill them, bury them, and do it quickly, do it secretly. So the fact that this was reportedly happening as the Russians drove out of Bucha was just kind of a bizarre thing. There's no motive at that point to do anything. Now it comes out, there's a very credible witness, fellow named Adrien Bouquet. I can't pronounce it, the French pronunciation, but he's a French former military serviceman. He's an author, wrote a book called Get Up and Walk Through Science, not a political book, obviously. And he decided to volunteer. You know, he got all fired up about what was going on in Ukraine and decided, I'm going to go and I'm going to help the Ukrainians. So he went there, and not as a military person, but as a sort of an aid type worker. And he was recently interviewed on a French radio station. And here's what he says. This is a quote. "I'm fully responsible for what I say. There on the spot, I witnessed war crimes. I've seen a lot of war crimes. I'm talking only about those I saw myself on the spot. Only those that were committed by the Ukrainian military, but not the Russian military. Now, I don't claim that the Russians did nothing, but I confirm the war crimes committed by the Ukrainian military," he said. Now, during that interview, Bouquet confirmed that the Bucha massacre was staged as it appeared from the first crime scenes. And this is interesting and troubling. He added that a lot of reporters from the United States are working in Ukraine and that they were filming the staged scenes. So you have this thing going on in the American media where they know if they want to have a job, they've got to lie. They've got to go along with all these hoaxes that are being perpetrated, or they're done. Now here, let me continue with what he says. Bucha was staged. The bodies of the victims were moved from other places and deliberately placed in such a way as to produce a shocking shooting, he stated. And then he goes on to say he was shocked by the fact that French TV channels, rely on people who know nothing about what's happening instead of talking to people who actually have been there and come back. Now here, let me go back to quoting from him. He says, "When we entered Bucha by car, I was in the passenger seat. And as we drove through the city, I saw bodies of people on the sides of the streets. And at the same time, I saw people's bodies being taken out of trucks and laid out next to the bodies lying on the ground to give the effect of mass killings. One of the volunteers who was at this place the day before told me that he saw refrigerator trucks from other cities of Ukraine coming to Bucha and unloading bodies and laying them out in rows. I realized from this that they were staging mass massacres. We were warned that if we took photos or videos, we would get imprisonment for 10 years or more severe consequences." He goes on to say that he witnessed inhumane treatment of Russian prisoners, and there certainly are videos of horrific war crimes committed by Ukrainians against the Russian soldiers. Now, this is what Bouquet says about the crimes on the Russian prisoners. Quote, "When I talk about murder and torture, I'm talking about the murder and torture of the Russian military. Officers were the first to be executed. I heard shouts when the Azov men asked who the officer was. As soon as they got the answer, they immediately shot that person in the head. The worst thing is that I saw no human attitude, no emotions, because I saw people being executed, people being tortured, people being killed, shot in their limbs and heads, he said. So to me, I found the initial reports of mass killings in Bucha to be highly questionable. I found it quite doubtful that the Russians had done it, much more likely that it had actually been done by the Ukrainians themselves. Perhaps they came in and in some cases identified people who were too helpful to the Russians, too sympathetic. Perhaps they gave them food or something. The Ukrainians have a very, very bad reputation for being quite brutal. And I think they may have taken some of those people out and just murdered them. But then apparently from what Mr. Bouquet says, there also were bodies moved from other cities in Ukraine. In any event, I'm quite convinced at this point that the whole thing was staged. There's no more truth to the idea that the Russians did that than there was truth to the myth of the ghost of Kiev, the imaginary pilot who shot down 40 jets and never really existed at all, never shot down anything because he didn't exist.